Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. The Beginner's Guide to Decolonization is presented in partnership with Afghan women's organization Refugee Immigrant Services and Skills for Change. Thank you for making this event possible, and a special welcome to the staff of both organizations who are attending both in person and online. So today's talk is super important, and it's going to be given by a super important person who's having a super important day today. NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun has been a member of our community forever, and we've had some adventures today, and he's one of my major influencers. So if there's a problem, it's his fault. Hopefully, we're going to answer a lot of questions like how to speak to Indigenous people, how to approach Indigenous organizations, what's appropriation versus appreciation, things like that. So this is a really good foundation for us to have. You'll hear people say we can't have truth without reconciliation, but we can't have any of that until we figure out how to talk to each other. So I think I've covered it, and I will now give you the stage.
Awesome. Joan, before you take off, I want to acknowledge that you left your cell phone up here on the table. But also before you take off, I want to acknowledge that as we do as Indigenous people, we acknowledge all the hard work that people do for the things that we do. So I want to take a moment right now to acknowledge Joan and say, Chimigwech, Joan, for the work that you do, because this work that you're doing is so extremely important because it provides Indigenous people an opportunity to speak truth. And as we move forward in truth and reconciliation, it's extremely important that non-Indigenous people get to hear the stories and get to hear the voices and get to hear the truth of Indigenous people, because far too long in Canada, in our own territories, we were forbidding at many levels to be able to speak this truth, or nobody provided this opportunity for us to speak truth. So, Joan, I want to present you with some traditional medicines now that you've sat down and got comfortable. So I want to give you some traditional medicines to acknowledge you and all of your ancestors that have brought you to do this amazing work that you do. So Chimigwech. Yep. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, you said somebody was going to do a welcome? Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us both in person and online. Today, we're thrilled to have you, and I'm personally, and I'm pretty sure everyone is looking forward to learn from your inspiring experiences and prospects today. I just wanted to, before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge the land that we are all gathered on today. Afghan Women Organization acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationship with the land upon which Afghan Women Organization is located that precedes the organization's establishment. Afghan Women Organization acknowledges its presence on the traditional land of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Sacramento has been taken care of by the Anishnaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, the Chippewa, and the Métis people. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We recognize the deep, systematic, and ongoing violence faced by Indigenous people across the country and actions needed by all to promote justice, truth, and reconciliation. We acknowledge and are grateful for the ongoing privilege we have as settlers, immigrants, and refugees to live and work on this land. We also acknowledge we have responsibility to engage as allies to work together towards the truth and reconciliation. Thank you. I also would like to extend my gratitude for the Northern Community House, Toronto North Lib, and also the Skills for Change for collaborating on this initiative and for providing us the opportunity to be part of this great initiative. And also, I would like to extend our sincere appreciation to our founder, Ways Mariam Hafsa Asifa Fund, for their generous support to make this session possible today. Thank you. And I'll stop.
Bonjour, NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun Anishnaabe Ojokwe. So my name is Longfeather. I come from the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. My mother comes from the Chippewa Sarnie Reserve, both now known as Ajudana and Amshanong, because those titles that we have in many of our Indigenous communities are titles that were forced upon us, imposed upon us by settlers, by newcomers here into the territory who couldn't speak our languages. So my colonizer's name is Lyndon George. And with many Indigenous nations and groups, we don't have surnames. So my real name is NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun, and it translates to Longfeather. And I know that in English, Longfeather sounds like it wants to be two words, but in its translation from the Anishnaabe language into English, it's one word. And with that name comes many roles and responsibilities. My name, Lyndon George, and it's really important that we understand some of the work that we need to do is we have to be able to understand our shared history and the history of the relationship of Indigenous people in Canada here. We have to understand that history to know what went wrong, to how do we fix it, and where do we go from there. And so one of those things is language, of course. That's been a barrier for Indigenous people. And names are extremely important for Indigenous people. And for instance, in my case, Lyndon George was a name that was forced upon me. My parents were forced to have to give me an English name because we live in an English colony. We live in a place that the British had ruled for many, many times, and a monarchy is still something here that is happening here in Canada. And so George, the last name, the surname reflects that British monarchy. Lyndon was a name that upon going into the hospital, my parents giving birth to me, they had to give me a name. So 60 years ago on this day, my parents chose the name Lyndon because Lyndon Johnson was the president of the United States. And my mom had a crush on Lyndon Johnson, thought he was cute. Let's name this child. I was the 9th of 11 children in my family. So my name became Lyndon George. And so other than knowing that Lyndon Johnson, that's where my name comes from, that name has no meaning for me. It's a reflection of harm that has happened to Indigenous people. It's a reflection and a reminder of the ongoing harm that happens to Indigenous people by institutions that continue to demand that Indigenous people have a surname. My real name, NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun, is very different. My colonizer's name, Lyndon George, by the way, only took my parents a couple weeks to decide to call me Lyndon George. My real name, NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun, that took my father 3.5 years of ceremony. Every night he would do tobacco ceremony, and he would have a relationship and a conversation with our ancestors and say, who is this kid? Who is this child? You can see his future. You know what he has to do. You know his roles and responsibilities. And after 3.5 years of doing that ceremony every night, he had this dream, this vision of who I was going to be. And so as a younger individual, my father had shared to me the meaning of that name and the roles and responsibilities that came with it at that time. So Longfeather translates and comes with the roles and responsibilities that he was shown me as a young person who had no arms, but my arms were these long feathers. And in these long feathers, I would always want to bring Indigenous people, our people, into those feathers and protect them from any harm. And that I would always work with Indigenous people, our own people, to help change things, to help make things better. And that's actually what happened. throughout my lifetime. I've always worked with Indigenous people, either within an Indigenous community or in urban centers. And I've always worked on the cutting edge of things. So some of the things that I do now as an Indigenous Justice Coordinator in a very horrific colonial legal system is I help build new systems that are better for Indigenous people. Because one thing that we know in 2024 now, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after those calls to action, after murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, trans-identifying two-spirit people, and the calls for justice, after the United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous People, and so many other inquiries that have happened in Canada here on the harms done to Indigenous people, is that we know all of these institutions that we have in Canada, the colonial legal system, colonial education system, colonial health systems, colonial policing systems, all of these institutions were built without the consultation of Indigenous people. All of these institutions were built on the values, morals, standards, and belief of other nations and other communities outside our own territories, and that they were not reflective of our values, our beliefs, our morals. They were not reflective of our legal principles and our legal applications. They were not reflective of any of our constructs like family constructs or gender identity constructs. They were built on somebody else's stuff. And we do know that over 400 or 500 years of oppression here with Indigenous people, there's been an existence of what everybody calls a country of Canada. There's been an existence of harm here that's happened from the very first piece of legislation, the very first piece of law that happened here in this territory, known as the Doctrine of Discovery. Before we start talking about a lot of that stuff, because my job in the next hour, in the next 44 minutes, is to help you better understand 500 plus years of oppression and where we have to go from there. But this is a perfect opportunity to talk about cultural appropriation and the harm done to Indigenous people. So in the picture you see behind me is what you're seeing here is an appropriation of Indigenous culture. And I want to help you better understand why it's harmful for Indigenous people. On your left-hand side, my right-hand side behind me, you'll see Indigenous sacred items that are being used in the fashion industry. They're very, very meaningful for Indigenous people. Specifically, I want to draw attention to the headdress that the young woman is wearing here, and what we would refer to as a sacred item. That sacred item is gifted by a nation or by a community to an individual who has provided a lifetime of work back into that community. And so it represents somebody who has given back to an Indigenous community, somebody who has provided a very important service for Indigenous people. And it's been a lifelong process of doing that work. That's an appropriation and it's a disrespect to Indigenous people. The other thing that's important about that particular picture is the sexualization of the woman who's wearing some of the other sacred items, which are the turquoise and silver. So for our relatives down in the South, the Indigenous people down in the South, silver and turquoise is part of their regalia. Part of what I'm wearing, my shells on my ears and around my neck, that's part of my traditional regalia, part of my traditional clothing that I wear, that tells a story about who I am, where I come from, some of my roles and responsibilities. Other Indigenous people would be able to notice that. So there's that appropriation that's happened to our relatives from the South, the silver and the silver and the turquoise. But the sexualization of the body and the shame that comes with body is not an Indigenous construct. We did not sexualize the body. We did not have the same systems of shame that other people brought over here. We did not sexualize the breast. So here in Canada, when everybody was freaking out because women were out in public breastfeeding, Indigenous people sat back and thought, this is crazy. This is something natural. This is how mothers feed their children. But it was because people sexualized the human anatomy. That's not something that Indigenous people done. That's somebody else's garbage. That's somebody else's shame. We were never ashamed of our bodies. Creator, we believe that Creator did not give us anything to be ashamed of, that we're to be proud of all who we are and what we represent in all the work that we do. The other picture to my left, which will be to your right, that is a Halloween costume. And what is most offensive about that is not the fact that people think that it's our regalia, our traditional clothing, which tells a story about who we are, where we come from, our roles and responsibilities, our clan systems, our sacred and spiritual colors, and all kinds of other wonderful stuff about that make us unique in this entire universe. But it's also the use of something that's extremely sacred for Indigenous people. And that's, she's holding up a pipe. The pipe is not something that every Indigenous person has. The pipe is restricted to heavily spiritual ceremonies for Indigenous people. And so the harm that's done by having these things happen for Indigenous people is other people think that it's okay to make fun of or make jest or to mimic who we are as Indigenous people. And when you make fun of or mimic who we are as Indigenous people and our sacred items, then there's a whole total lack of disrespect that happens. And when you disrespect somebody, then that allows for the ugly shroud and the ugly face of racism and discrimination to sneak into. So that's extremely important. So each of us who now live in this country that they call Canada have a role and responsibility. When you live in this territory, you are a treaty holder, you are a treaty member. And it is our responsibility to acknowledge those treaties that were signed that are still living documents. And it's important for us to be able to call in or call out those actions. I would hope that as human beings, when we're walking down the street and we see somebody beating up a woman, that we're going to stop and say, hey, stop that. I do. It may put me in harm, but I at least make my voice heard, because that's responsibility and that's accountability. And we need to look out for each other. We need to protect each other. So in the same case, we share the responsibility to call out any forms of cultural appropriation, any forms of appropriation, or any forms of harm that happen to any group of individuals. One of the things I want to talk about is quickly is a clan system for Indigenous people. So we must remember over 500 years plus, there's so much harm that has happened to Indigenous people. And prior to everybody coming over here, we have to remember that Indigenous people, we had our own systems. We had everything going on here. We had our own healthcare, we had our own policing, we had our own governance systems. And our governance systems often were the clan systems. And in the clan systems, everybody had roles and responsibilities. In the clan systems, for instance, somebody who might have been part of the Deer clan, your responsibility was housing. And as your role and responsibility under housing, you would make sure that nobody is homeless, that everybody has a roof over their head. You might have the responsibility under the Elk clan for healthcare to make sure that everybody had access to medicines and healthcare that was provided in the community. You might have a responsibility for clothing to make sure everybody has clothing. So in our clan systems, every clan had a role and responsibility, and everybody had a voice in our clan system. Meaning, unlike this electoral process, we are forced to have to vote somebody in, and we just have to trust that they're going to present our worldview. We have to trust that they understand who we are and where we come from. And I don't think that happens here in Canada. I don't think our elected leadership know the harm done to NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun. I don't think the elected leadership here in Canada knows the harm done to women. I don't think the elected leadership always know the harm done to queer folks here in Canada. I don't think that the elected leadership knows the harm that continues to happen to our young people here in these territories. And so our voices are not being heard. In our governance system, all of those groups that I've just spoken about whose voices are not heard, they are heard. Underneath our clan systems, we have clan mothers, chiefs in our community, hereditary chiefs. We're born knowing who the next leader is, but chiefs really don't have a big voice in our community. Underneath the chiefdom are our clan mother systems. The clan mothers, our women, those are the ones who have power. Those are the ones who have voices in our communities. Those are the ones who are telling the chiefs what's going on in the community and what they need to take care of and how to do it. And then under those clan mothers, we might have heads of states in some of our communities. So every family has a spokesperson that goes to their clan mother and tells the clan mother, this is what's happening in our home. This is what we need help with. Then the clan mother takes that to the chief. So what I want to do is I want us to do a little bit of an exercise. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of you a clan system. And in that clan system, we're going to do a dance. And then I'm going to talk about why that dance is important. So we're going to start over here, and we're going to hear in the front row first. You will be Eagle Clan, Wolf Clan, Coyote Clan, 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 Eagle Clan, back there with the hoodie, Wolf Clan, with the mask on, Eagle Clan. Does everybody have a clan? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to move around these black chairs here. So members of the Eagle Clan, we're going to go in a clockwise position because I'm Anishnaabe. And Anishnaabe people, we go in a clockwise. And I'm going to talk about that too. Eagle Clan people, you're going to move like this. Coyote people, you're going to move like this. Whale Clan, did I say Whale Clan? What's the other clan? Wolf Clan. Wolf Clan, let's change you to the Raven Clan. And Raven Clan people, you're going to move like this. Do I have the three clans now? Okay. So if everybody wants to stand up. So if we could start our music, that would be awesome. I'm sorry that the folks online, if you want to pick a clan and dance around your desk or wherever you're at, please join us by doing
Blaze. You know, Electric Powwow is going on tonight. That's right, a tribe called Red. Are you going to check them out? Give me a call. Let me know. Let's get into the latest from nation
Here we go,
to
folks.
nation.
Let's start moving around. The music just gets quiet, it doesn't stop. what I want you to do is look around the circle that's moving and somehow find the individuals who are doing the same dance as you are and dance in the circle with them. So all the raven people should be dancing together. The coyote people should be dancing together. And all the eagle people should be dancing together. But keep moving in your circle. You should keep moving around in your circle here. Nope, come to the bigger circle. But we'll have the eagles all dancing together. The coyotes all dancing together. The raven people, you should all still be part of the big circle. Perfect. If we can stop now, just stay where you are. I don't know how to, the only way I'm going to know how to shut that off is kick it. Let's just, perfect. So can you go back to your group? Now I want you to take a look around the room. Where are my eagle people? Where are my coyotes? And then we have the ravens. So it's not unfamiliar when Indigenous people gather that, particularly at spaces like powwows, that the conductor or the influencer of that ceremony, yes, we must always remember that those powwows that we go to and we watch Indigenous people dance and the vendors are up for Indigenous people, that's still ceremony that happens. Because when you go into that powwow, what you don't see is all the spiritual work that happens before, the spiritual work that's happening during, and the spiritual work that happens after you're gone. So it's not unfamiliar that Indigenous people, when we gather in those spaces, that the conductor or the influencer or the arena director will ask everybody, do your clan dance. And so you would come out knowing your clan, knowing your dance, and you would start moving around in a circle. And in that circle, when you look around and you see people who are doing the same dance as you are, because right across Turtle Island, right across North America, regardless of the nation that you come from, there are going to be similar clans. And so while everybody's doing that clan dance, you can look around in that circle and you can see who are members of your clan family. They are now your siblings. This is your spiritual family. And there are roles and responsibilities that you have towards those members of your new family. And there are restrictions that you have as well in terms of the relationship that you can have with people from the same clan family, even if you've never met them. Even if I'm Anishnaabe and somebody's Haudenosaunee, or if I'm Anishnaabe, somebody is Lakota or Navajo, and we're doing the same dance, we're a spiritual family now, we're of the same clan, we are of the same clan system, and there's no way that we can embark on anything that even resembles an intimate relationship. Everybody have a seat, please. The clan system is so important for Indigenous people because it also affords us an opportunity to be able to live out our roles and responsibility. Our roles and responsibilities are extremely important for us. However, through this system of genocide that Canada has pushed on Indigenous people, the clan system is something that many Indigenous communities cannot follow any longer. And we cannot follow it because the levels of government refuse to deal with our hereditary chiefs, our clan mothers, or our heads of states. They will only deal with the oppressive electoral system, Indian Act system, governance system that we have. So have people heard about the Indian Act before? The Indian Act is based on, the Indian Act is the most racist and discriminatory piece of law anywhere in the world. There's no other group of people who have a law that dictates to them what they can and cannot do. And under that Indian Act, so many horrific things have happened for Indigenous people. Things like residential schools, things like federal Indian day schools, things like that we haven't even started to talk about yet, like Indian hospitals. We haven't really started talking about federal Indian day schools. We just started that conversation in southwestern Ontario a couple weeks ago, and the harm done to Indigenous people. We haven't talked about, to great lengths, child welfare cases. We haven't talked about the experiments that were done on Indigenous people. And so in order for us, now that we have all of these things that we're fighting to regain and reclaim, that's changing the landscape of how Canada looks. But again, as we move forward, looking at what our roles and responsibilities are towards truth and reconciliation, we have to be mindful of the harm done. So the governance system, the traditional governance system of Indigenous people is one thing that's harmed Indigenous people enormously, because throughout the years, remember that it was outlawed for Indigenous people to do these things, to do anything spiritual, to connect with anything that is directly related to us being Indigenous. We couldn't speak our languages. Sometimes when I go out shopping, when I go to the Piggly Wiggly Walmart, and I go out shopping and I'm standing in line and I'm hearing new people who have come over to our territory and they're speaking your languages, I get really jealous because we weren't allowed to speak our languages. Canada failed me, and Canada failed Indigenous people, and Canada failed non-Indigenous people, because Canada should have first afforded me an opportunity to learn about who I am as an Indigenous person. They should have afforded me an opportunity to learn my language rather than being forced to take English. Canada did offer me the opportunity to learn French, but I was so stubborn growing up that when I was we were forced to have to go to French class. And I hated it so much, but I hated it because I wanted to learn my language. And I felt that it was just as important in a school where 75% of the student population were Anishnaabe kids, that they offered us an opportunity to learn our language rather than having to learn French. So I was that little Indigenous kid in French class who sat like this. I'm not doing your test. I'm not saying hello in French. I'm not speaking to you. I'm not asking you quelle est-il. I'm not asking you those things because I want to learn my language. And after 3 years of sitting there like this, the French teacher finally said to me, I'm giving you 51 because I want you out of my class. I did nothing to get that, but she wanted me out of her class. I grew up as that person. Some of you folks heard my story. I'm a family member of Lyndon George from the Upper Wash Crisis. So some of you folks had heard that story about how I had to grow up fighting for the return of our traditional territory, formerly known as Military Camp Ipperwash, when the government used the War Measures Act to come and take my father's land, promised to give it back after the war. 75 years later, we had to finally walk in and serve a notice of eviction to the Department of National Defense and say, get off our land because we want to move home. And in that Indian Act, the reason we had to do that is because in that Indian Act and the British North American Act, they built these reserve systems, and those communities known as reserves were built on the Indigenous population at that time. Because in a system of genocide that Canada pushed on Indigenous people, we were not supposed to be here in 2024. And so those reserves that we see across Canada, those First Nations communities, were built on a population of hundreds of years ago. And so the real fact is that anywhere from 50 to 85% of Indigenous people connected to a First Nations, Inuit, or Métis community, we have to live outside of our communities because there's no place for us to live. They didn't leave us enough of our own land, our own territory to grow. So the clan system is so important because it teaches us about all those roles and responsibilities, but this oppressive system of genocide that Canada forced on Indigenous people did not allow and would not allow us to continue to teach even our own children things like our language. It was against the law for 2, 3, or 4 Indigenous people to gather. Because if we were gathering, then there's a possibility that we were speaking our language and other generations would learn that. So in order for us to move forward, we have to be mindful of that harmful history. So we're going to quickly go through some of that history, just to remind folks where we come from and where we have to go. So on our next slide, sorry about that, I'm not supposed to move because of the camera, but I'm standing in the way of. So what we call this is a disruption of our peace, because we had to remember that prior to anybody coming here, Indigenous people, we had our own stuff going on. We had our own governance systems. We had our own leadership. We had our own health systems. We had our own legal systems. We had all of these magnificent things that were going on. And I think the most important thing for everybody to remember, if you don't remember anything else from my big fat Ojibwe lips moving around here today, is please remember that everything that we do and everything that was built in Indigenous ways of life and Indigenous ways of being comes from a place of respect. One of our very first teachings that we have as Anishnaabe people is that we're all the same and that everything has a spirit. And there's no spirit better or bigger than anybody else's. That the female spirit is no better than my spirit. The male spirit is no better than my spirit. The spirit of the rock is no better than my spirit. Everything is a living entity. The spirit of the tree, the spirit of the water, the spirit of the air. Everything that we do is very spiritual, but there's a recognition that we're all equal and nobody's better. That includes the water. That includes the land. That includes the four-legged, the two-legged, those that swim, those that fly, all of those things, the flowers. When I was a little kid growing back home up in my reserve in my community, we all grew up together. And because my father's family was forced from our community to make the military camp, so we were put right on the corner of a nearby Indigenous community, and most of it was swampland. And when my grandparents got to find their home, because the government just came over, moved it out, and moved it over to the next reserve, they found their home in a foot of water. And so they had to raise it up, and then they had to build it up so that they could continue to thrive there. And then they were able to purchase other areas of land around them so that all of the aunties and uncles, all of my other parents and other siblings and other, I'm going to talk about that construct in one very quick second. We all grew up there. But one day I was hop skipping over to my grandma's house, and it was a springtime, and there was this great big beautiful bed of lily of the valley underneath her front window. So I picked up a handful and I went inside, took them to her. My grandmother being very thankful, thank you very much. Let's go back outside. She took me back outside, and that was the first teaching that I got, that flower has a spirit and that flower has life. And you can't just go and destroy that without acknowledging the life of that flower. So she taught me the tobacco ceremony, and she taught me to talk to the spirit and the life of that plant and say, thank you. Thank you for the beauty that you bring to this universe. Thank you for the beauty of fragrance that you bring to this universe. That was my first teaching. And that meant something to me, because after that, I can remember walking back home through the bush, walking by the pond and thinking about the water there and how I had to, be kind to the water, thinking about the fish that were living in there, thinking about the tall grasses, thinking about the trees. That just changed my life significantly. So everything that we do as Indigenous people comes from a very spiritual place, and it's an acknowledgement of all of our ancestors and everything that has a spirit. So, but there was a disruption of our peace that happened. So when folks start, could we go to the next slide, please? So we had to remember that all of these things were Indigenous people. We had all of our stuff going on. Next slide, please. Now we have to think about who were these people who were coming over here onto Turtle Island and into our territories. Next slide, please. The first one was the Spanish in 1594. So what we have to remember about when newcomers, when settlers, when explorers were all coming over here, what did they bring with them? They brought their own values. They brought their own beliefs. They brought their own morals. They brought their own standards, and they pushed them on Indigenous people. They brought their own forms of religion and spiritual beliefs. So essentially what happened with Balboa is what's happened to Indigenous people over time. Let's remember what was going on in Europe at this time when the explorers were coming here, because that's extremely important to remember because it influences what has happened to Indigenous people. So what do we know about this time era? This is a time era of who was in charge in England. Liz I, Queen Elizabeth. And what do we know about Queen Elizabeth? Not Liz who just died. The original Elizabeth I. This is a time period that women had no voice, period. Women were disposable. Women had no worth. Women's only purpose was to be pregnant and to give birth and to feed men. That's it. That was your purpose. That's how the monarchy saw women. That's how English saw women. Liz I only had a voice because she was born into that monarchy. So she had a voice, a very commanding voice. She was a ruler. What else was happening at this time? This was also the time of who? Shakespeare. What was going on with Shakespeare? Sure, he wrote some really pretty stuff, had some really nice words, but what do we know what was going on in and around Shakespearean era? This is a time, again, where women had no worth. Women had no voice. Women could not be on stage as actors. And any woman who dare stepped on stage to be an actor would be quickly labeled as either a whore or a witch. And what do we know about this particular time? What they did with women who were labeled a whore or a witch? Well, it was permissible to take a whore or take a witch into the middle of the village, tie her up, put beside her a bundle, not a bundle, but a pile of rocks, and every villager who would come by was encouraged by the sentinels or the guards, pick up a rock and hit the witch. Stone the whore. That's how they treated their women. This was also the time period of great fighting that was going on, and it was religious wartime. Right? So it was a Protestants and the Catholics fighting over resources, over land. So when all those resources and all those lands were taken and they were swallowed up by all the groups in Europe, the Spanish were the ones who said, well, let's hop on our big boat, go across a big creek and see if we can find some new land. So poof, they did that. And they landed on the very southern point of what we call Turtle Island, North America. And when they got off their Spanish boat and came onto the land, poof, they ran into other two-legged people. And those were Indigenous people. Those were our relatives to the south. And as they started to move into our communities, they saw some things that they didn't like. They saw some things that were against their values, their beliefs, their morals, and their standards. One of those first things was they saw women with voices, clan mothers, strong women who were leading communities, warrior women who were on horses and fighting in wars against other nations. They saw women who were dressed like men, and they saw men who were dressed like women. They didn't like this stuff. So the Spanish, with the leadership of Balboa, got back onto the boat, hopped across a big creek, went back to their leadership and their church and said, hey, we found some new land for you, but There's some crazy, whacked out people over there. And we can get this land for you. However, we're going to have to teach these people right from wrong. And so in order to do that, we're going to need to go over there with the army, and we're going to need to go over there with the mad rabid dogs. So the leadership in Spain, as well as the church, endorsed them and said, do it. Get back on your big boat, go across the big creek, get over there and change those people. Change those pagans and those savages. Help them better understand that the Holy Trinity is the only way, that our God, our Jesus, and our virgins are the only way that they will ever survive. And then take whatever you can get. So that's what they did. The Spanish hopped on, came back over here. And the first thing that they did was they start talking to the men in the communities and started to convince men by giving them gifts, guns and blankets and foods and other things, took advantage of impoverished Indigenous people perhaps, used that to their benefit and said, we'll give you these things, but shut that woman up. That woman with the big voice who's telling you what to do, you need to take power over her. This is what we do back home with our women who try to tell the men what to do. We beat them. So they introduce violence. I've been working on the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, Girls, Trans Identifying inquiry report and pushing for that inquiry for a very long time. And this is what we identify as the very first act of violence against Indigenous women, girls, trans identifying. So they brought over their system of violence on Indigenous women. But we also know that this is the first time that they also introduced violence against Indigenous queer two-spirit people, two-heart people. Those are two major constructs for Indigenous people that have continued to be oppressed through colonization, are the constructs of family and gender identity. When Spanish explorer Balboa come over here, and when all the other groups started coming over here, they brought with them two genders, male and female. They did not even think, or they did not even entertain that perhaps the groups who are living here have a different construct of gender. In Indigenous communities right across Turtle Island, we have been recognizing anywhere from 13, 17 different genders in our community. And with those genders come roles and responsibilities. And so when you have an oppressive genocidal system that oppresses the constructs of Indigenous people, that includes gender and gender identity, that includes our roles and responsibilities. And in our roles and responsibilities, remember, in our clan system, as Indigenous queer two-spirit, I might have housing. So if I can't fulfill my roles and responsibilities, I can't fulfill housing, so then we're going to end up with homelessness. That's how our systems run. Everybody has roles and responsibilities. The other construct that is extremely important and is affected by colonial legal system is a construct of family. In many of your constructs of family, you have one mom and dad, and that's your biological mom and dad. With Indigenous people, we have many moms and dads. All of those aunties and uncles that you have, those are our moms and dads. And those extra moms and dads, those aunties and uncles, they carry all the same roles and responsibilities to me that my biological mom and dad do. So my father had 9 siblings. He had 8 siblings. He was the 9th. Those aunties and uncles, his 8 siblings, those are my moms and dads. And I should be able to go to them and ask them for $20 anytime that I want. But I also have roles and responsibilities to them as parents. And that means that they can come to me and they can give me heck and tell me that I'm doing something wrong and explain to me the right way to do it. That's their role and responsibility. As a 60-year-old right now, I have 80 nieces and nephews. I have nieces and nephews, great nieces and nephews, and great nieces and nephews. And my siblings who have had those children know that I carry the same responsibilities to their children, and that their children can come to me at any point in time. And should they die, my siblings, I have the responsibility to take over and parent and be caregivers. How it's oppressive for Indigenous people is when we look at things like policies and protocols, particularly around bereavement. Bereavement policies are built on a Eurocentric construct of family. They don't take into consideration that NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun has 17 mums and dads. They're only taking into consideration my biological mom and dad, and so they'll give me a little bit of time to take off in order to fulfill my responsibilities and grieve quickly for one mom and one dad. In our communities, when we think about family constructs, we have to also think about things like breastfeeding. When you have many moms, in my neighborhood, it was all aunties and uncles, my moms and dads, and our cousins. So your first cousins, those are my siblings. And I have the same roles and responsibility to many siblings. I have 10 biological siblings, but I have many first cousins, other siblings, because on my dad's side, they were big families. One family had 18, 16, 15, 11, 13, big families. So we have to take into consideration those roles and responsibilities that I have for all of those siblings. But in my neighborhood, if we think about legislation and child welfare laws and how it affected Indigenous people, it was not uncommon for our other moms to breastfeed all of those kids. I remember going into in and around my other moms and other dads' homes and seeing the other moms breastfeed their children from their siblings. And that was common because they were all breastfeeding at the same time. In child welfare law, that was forbidden. That those extra moms could not do and fulfill their roles and responsibilities. We have to think about the harm done to Indigenous people before we can move forward and address those harm. So we have to think about residential schools. We have to think about federal Indian day schools. We have to think about language loss. We have to think about racism and discrimination, how it affects Indigenous people. But one of the most important things that we have to think about is how that doctrine of discovery, which is another one of the most racist. So the doctrine of discovery, for people don't know, it's one of the very first pieces of legislation and law that happened here in Canada that basically gave the monarchy and the churches the opportunity to come over here and steal Canada, to steal Indigenous land, because what that piece of law states is that Indigenous people, we were not human beings, that we were animals. Because when you were going out and looking for new land in this big world, you could not take over any territory where other human beings were present. So when they came over here to Canada and saw that there were human beings here, they were quick to create a law that would announce us to the rest of the world as animals. You could take over territory if animals were present, but you could not take over territory if human beings were there. So once they did that, introduced the doctrine of discovery, and this was by the monarchy and by churches who did this, that gave them the open door to come in and introduce genocide, because now we were the only problem standing in the way of resources and standing in the way of land, and that they needed to get rid of us in order to take over all of this territory and take over all of these resources. So they had to think about very wisely, how do we do this? Let's institute all of these things to kill the Indian in the child. And that's become the motto of residential schools as well as federal Indian day school: kill the Indian in the child. Because once we kill all these Indians, Once we kill all these Indigenous people, then there's no title to land anymore. But here we are. In 2024, despite the fact that they sent my mother to residential school and tried to rape and beat the Indian out of her, she survived. Despite the fact that they sent my other mothers and my other fathers to residential school, they all survived. And they fought the worst domestic war in the world, while everybody else was over fighting for Canada. Right? There's still a lot of people who don't refer to Canada as a country based on the fact of the doctrine of discovery that was stolen land. While there were thousands of people who referred to themselves as Canadians who went to fight in big wars, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and other wars, we have to remember that little children, babies, in Canada were fighting the worst domestic war ever, and that was a war to survive. Through experiments, through all kinds of abuse, but they did. And so now in 2024, we have these new tools that we have as Indigenous people that we have to use to move forward. We have to use the calls to action and hold everybody accountable. Because what the government has failed to do to provide new relatives coming here, newcomers and settlers coming here to Canada, is they have failed to educate you on now your absorbed responsibilities when you come and live in this territory. They have failed to give you the knowledge about treaties. And the basic treaty in Canada is, of course, the Tuwa Wampum. And that means that Indigenous people, we're going to be over here in our river. And we're going to do the stuff that we need to do to be able to survive. And even if we have to fight for it, we're going to do it. And that's what we've done. We won't bother you. You do whatever you want to do over there in your boat and your ship. Just don't bug us with our stuff. We have our roles and responsibilities towards the land and the air and the water that we will fulfill. And you'll come in your ship and you'll bring all your stuff, all your beliefs, your standards, your morals, your values, and that's okay, but don't push that on us. We can live harmonious. That's what you've absorbed. This is what you have now, and this is how we have to move forward. So in the institutions that we've worked for, in the businesses that we're moving forward and we're working with, let us be mindful of this history that we share here in this country we call Canada. And let's be mindful for this simple fact. All of these things that have happened towards Indigenous people, they should never, ever, ever happen again to any other group. So we must always remember this past. And let's remember that when we bring Indigenous people into our circles, let's be mindful of how oppressive this history has been. And let's try to accommodate Indigenous people. What we do at my office now and in many of the circles I work in that crazy colonial legal system. But I also work in the education system, and I work in the health system, and I work in policing. Why? Because of the heavy, ugly face of racism and discrimination that still exists, not just for Indigenous people, but other groups here too. And we hope in those circles, by fighting for racism and hatred and discrimination to stop for Indigenous people, that it's going to stop for other folks too. That it's going to build policies, it's going to build procedures that are going to benefit other groups as well, not just Indigenous people. But let's be mindful that when we have Indigenous people, when we bring Indigenous people into the circles, we're the experts on who we are. We're the experts on our way of life and our way of being. Let us just move forward and let us walk together and do this work together. Let's talk about what needs to be done, rather than coming to the Indigenous person and saying, this is what you need to do. Let's sit down and have a conversation about how can we do this together. And that's the approach that we're taking at the community legal clinic that I work at and all the other circles that I work at, is it has to be with heavy consultation for Indigenous people. And we must remember that in doing so, that there are certain things that we have to do as Indigenous people. So before we go for simple things that we might overlook, for instance, in this space today, as we move forward, we will want to be mindful of the fact that we always do ceremony. That Joan and I, as Indigenous people, when we come together, we will do ceremony. And that means that we're going to burn some of our sacred medicines. And in those sacred medicines, we're preparing ourselves. Because when Indigenous people talk about this stuff, all this harm that's happened, we're opening that wound again. We're purposely triggering ourselves to educate you and to help you better understand. So when I talk about all this stuff, residential schools, federal Indian day schools, when I talk about residential schools and the calls to action, I'm mindful of the very real harm, physical, cultural, sexual harm that happened to my mom in residential school. And when I talk about federal Indian day school, I'm mindful and triggered about all those same harms that happened to me in those systems. I see Joan over there really trying to kick me off, so I'm just going to try and end this now, but let's try to there's so much more that we can talk about, and let's try to keep this momentum going, because we can build new systems that are going to benefit not just Indigenous people, but all people. But I have to close with this, because one of the things I will not compromise, I compromise a lot as an Indigenous person, I feel like. We want to make sure that we can do that ceremony, the lighting of smudges when we come into spaces. But also, because I've talked about my mom, I have a role and responsibility to honor her. So I'm going to sing an honor song for my mom. And it's an honor song for all Indigenous people who have had to experience the harm that they did, as my mother did in the Canadian Indian residential school system. And so I'm going to do that with an honor song. And I'm not singing for you, for your pleasure. This is very spiritual for me. This is a song that's been passed down from my relatives to me to honor my mom and her journey. So those will be my closing words, this song. And I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me into this space, for allowing me to share with you part of my story, part of the wisdom and the knowledge that I carry, and then to also, this song is really a traveling song as well. So on your journey, ask you to travel well. And I always remind people, particularly my nieces and nephews, my nieces and nephews are so lucky because they're growing up in a world where they can do stuff that we weren't allowed. You know, my mom and dad, they weren't allowed to dance at powwows like we did here today. They weren't allowed to do that because it was against the law, and they could be imprisoned or beaten. In my time, we could. So I go into powwows now and I dance, knowing that I do it because my mom and dad couldn't do it, and that my grandparents couldn't do it. My nieces and nephews now, they're afforded the opportunity to do all the things that were restricted by law. And some of those things also were music and song. And this is how we communicate what quite often is with music and song. So before Joan comes start pulling my hair out, Chimigwech, big thanks to you for joining me at this time, and I'll say farewell with this song. Mama pio getna kwa, manda getna kwa. Hey oh hey oh hey oh hey, hey oh hey oh hey. Hey oh hey oh hey oh hey, oh oh hey oh. Mama pio getna kwa, manda getna kwa. Hey oh hey oh hey oh hey oh hey oh hey. Jo getna kwa, mama pio getna kwa, manda getna kwa. Hey oh hey oh hey oh hey, hey oh hey oh oh hey oh hey oh hey oh hey oh. Watch Bama Piguaman. Sequana.
Wow. I'm I'm just speechless. What a powerful, inspiring, interactive, informative. I don't know, my words can describe this session was incredible. Thank you so much for providing the insights on your complex relationship that Canadians have with the Indigenous people, for describing the lasting impact of genocide and the challenges and the difficulties that Indigenous people faced. These thoughts have been eye-provoking for us. These also, sorry, sometimes the strategies you have provided us for decolonization, we will definitely take those steps into implementing those strategies. The strategies you have provided for decolonization will empower us to take meaningful steps towards the reconciliation. Let's give a big round of applause again for our amazing speaker here. Sorry, when you have an amazing speaker standing in front of you, you get very nervous. So I got nervous. I apologize for my words there. Once again, I would like to thank Northern Community Housing, Joanne, and Toronto North Lib, the Skills for Change, for collaborating on this great session with us. And also, I will extend our gratitude to our funder, WACE, Miriam Asifa Fund, for their generous support in making this training possible. As we leave today, let's carry these lessons with us and commit to being active participants in this journey. Together, we can foster understanding and respect for Indigenous ways of life. Thank you so much for joining again, and have a wonderful day, everyone. And thanks for those who joined us online. And I wish everyone was here, and it was very wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
I just want everybody to know that we'll have lunch in about 10 minutes over there. So I hope you'll join us. Why do you scream?
Before I roll this up, so I think at some point next month, Joan is going to invite me back, and I'm going to talk about specifically the construct of gender and gender identity, but in clothing and regalia and the importance of that. And I want to point out some of the magnificent work that Joan does. Joan often makes a lot of my ceremonial items, which are part of the Ojokwe, is one of the terms in the Anishnaabe language, my community, that help identify my gender identity, as well as my roles and responsibilities. So Joan has heard much of my stories over the years, and as she's heard the stories over the years, she would construct me. Joan is an amazing artist, and she can sew like nobody else that I know. And so she's heard my stories, and she will build part of my regalia, part of my traditional clothing, because our traditional clothing tells a story about who we are, where we come from, and all of these other wonderful things. So Joe knew that I was Anishnaabe and that we have a very important person in our history called Nanabuju. And so Joan took the artwork of Isaac Murdoch with his permission and created that onto a skirt for me. And so this is Isaac Murdoch's visualization of a very, very important individual in Indigenous history, Anishnaabe history, and that's Nanabuju. And she took that picture and put it on a ceremonial skirt. She also put this part of his work as well on the back. And all of the colors that you would see on this traditional ribbon skirt are the colors that would be embraced by the rainbow. And because I am Anishnaabe Ojokwe, Indigenous queer two-spirit, two-heart, that's the story that this ceremonial item carries. So when we do ceremony, these are the items that we would put on. So hopefully at some point in time, I'll be able to show you more of the amazing work that Joan has done, because the ceremonial items that she has built for me, they tell a story about different things that have happened in my lifetime. So I just wanted to share that.